Welcome to the London History Podcast, brought to you by londonguidedwalks.co.uk. I'm Hazel Baker, qualified London tour guide and host of the show, taking you through the streets, stories and characters that have shaped the city we love. Today we are stepping into the world of one of England's most beloved authors, but through a very special lens. Our guest is Caroline Jane Knight, Jane Austen's fifth great-niece and the last of Jane's family to grow up at Chawton House, the great house on the estate where Jane lived nearby at Chawton Cottage and wrote and published many of her most famous works. From childhood, Caroline was immersed in Austen family life and tradition, eating from the same Wedgwood service Jane herself dined from and wrote about in 1813. Growing up, surrounded by family stories passed down through 15 generations, and spending summers talking to Austen lovers in the Chawton House tea room. Those living memories, artefacts and daily rituals mean Jane Austen has never been just a figure on a book cover for Caroline, but part of the fabric of home. At 18, inspired by Jane's own spirit of independence, Caroline left Chawton to build her own path, spending 25 years in international business and ultimately serving as a global CEO in the marketing world. Today, she has come full circle, dedicating her work to sharing and preserving her Austen heritage through her memoir, Jane and Me, My Austen Heritage, her Jane Austen's Niece weekly stories, in-person and virtual talks, and summer tours at Chawton. She's also founder and chair of the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation and patron of Jane Austen Regency Week. In this episode, we'll be exploring Jane's own connections with the capital, how London shaped her life, works and legacy, Caroline's childhood at Chawton, and how her current heritage work is preserving the Austens' family's memories for Janeites, historians and future generations. So whether you're listening from a London bus or walking past a Georgian terrace worthy of an Austen heroine, settle in as we bring Jane Austen's London, then and now, to life. Caroline, welcome to the London History Podcast. So today we are going to be talking about Jane Austen and London, but I suppose the first question I really should ask you is, can you introduce yourself?
So I am Caroline Jane Knight, as everybody will know, and I'm Jane's fifth great niece, which I have to say in itself, of course, whilst that's a wonderful relationship to have, in itself isn't actually necessarily that unusual. There are about 2,500 people alive today that are descended from Jane's brothers. So there's actually a lot of people out there, as I said, that would have a similar kind of relationship. But really where I am so lucky is I got to grow up in Chawton House, which is the manor house that belonged to Jane's brother, who's my fourth great-grandfather. And Jane spent the last 8 years of her life living in Chawton Cottage, which is part of the Chawton estate. So, I grew up, as I said, at Chawton House when it was still the family home of the Austen Knight family, my family. So I know it sort of in that context. And even when I was a child, Jane was, of course, world-renowned and drew tens of thousands of visitors a year to Chawton and to our home. So I have been talking to Jane Austen fans since before I can remember, and obviously really being in awe, actually, of her incredible legacy and the impact she has on people.
It's interesting, isn't it, when people think, oh, she just wrote romance. And I remember one review, or a contemporary review I read at the time about how her work, Emma, was domestic. I mean, like, what else do you expect her to write about?
It's part of her incredible cleverness, is she wrote things that on the face of it were incredibly simple, but actually, to the right reader, which is most of us, are not simple. And actually, even in her day, her books were approved reading for ladies. But what they're actually doing is teaching women to think for themselves. They're actually, what's actually in there is women challenging, the norms and whether or not they should go along with what society thinks in all sorts of different ways. And I actually think that's really brilliant because, as I said, if you read Jane Austen, it's empowering, isn't it? And it does make you think. People channel Lizzie Bennet's bravery. And that's something that as I said, was very clever, because that was all wrapped up in incredibly simple, as you say, domesticity, which made them on the face of it seem quite boring, I suppose, to the wrong eyes.
What I like is the female friendships, women supporting women in the story. And I still get secondhand embarrassment whenever I read Emma.
Living in Chawton Cottage with her master and their very good friend Martha Lloyd, who lived with them. That was 4 ladies living on their own, supporting each other. And the ladies in that cottage were all supporting Jane writing. They took more than their fair share of chores. They arranged things so that Jane had the time she needed every day to sit down and properly write. So that really was, I think that was playing out in her work, was her own experience of that closeness with other women. It's always a pleasure to go to, Henrietta Street or Hans Place or the places that were actually her brother Henry's home. And I'm now in London mostly because now in my life I'm founder and chair of the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation. I also, I write as Jane Austen's niece and do all sorts of things, as I said, as Jane Austen's niece. And so that kind of takes me to London. Most years I'll be there for something. And actually the bit of London that I most enjoy going to, which kind of, to me, is where I kind of get most excited about Jane, is in the sort of Covent Garden, the sort of theatre district, because we know how much Jane loved that. And actually she went out a lot in London. That's where she experienced, things that we see in her works. That's how she knew what that London society is. She saw famous Shakespearean actors. She saw all sorts of things and society going on. And to me, that is such a sort of exciting vision of Jane, sort of in the hustle and bustle. It's such a contrast, I suppose, to the village life. And I think it's, of course, we know that Jane wrote about what she knew about. She didn't write about things she hadn't experienced herself. There's no part of her work where we've got 2 men speaking on their own, because she didn't know what that would be. So it's not there. And London, all of the glittering London parts of her stories have come from her being there herself. And as I said, that sort of, the glittering part of London, that's the bit that for me, I think I find it really exciting to sort of think about Jane there, observing, soaking it in, getting the fuel for her stories.
For our listeners, there is also a green plaque. If you're going in that direction, then make sure you check it out. And we know about her excitement and all the plays and the operas she visited.
Now, there is something very special that she did in London, which is probably the story that is very much one that connects me to Jane. And that is in one visit, so we're in September 1813, Pride and Prejudice has been released early that year, and she's in London with her brother Edward, who's my 4th great-grandfather, and they go to the Wedgwood showroom, and they choose a dinner set, which is going to be Edward's, they have, the best dinner set, and that's what they're choosing for him to have. And they choose a dinner set, and later that night, Jane writes to Cassandra, because Cassandra isn't in London with them, and she describes this dinner set of being purple lozenges between lines of narrow gold and is to have the crest. The dinner service was then, so it's got the family crest on it, the dinner service was then produced, and Jane ate from it, and that dinner service has been passed down through my family, and my parents own it, and this is it. So we actually have here, for those people that can see, we actually have the lozenges of purple between lines of narrow gold, and that is the family crest. And when I was a child, this was still our posh set, if you know what I mean, like every family has. So I ate off this as a child. So, that is something that I think, yes, as I said, that is when I think about London as well with Jane, as I said, this is a key story. As I said, and that all happened on the 16th of September, 1813. And and an enormous amount of it survives today, with the dinner set. And it was actually, we used it when I was young for, Easter lunch or, those sort of special occasions. And actually it was used again this year for my parents' 60th wedding anniversary. It actually came out and was used again, which is just lovely for it to still be in use. Although, of course, it's extremely well taken care of. Once when I was young, I would have been about 13, 14. So we're in about 1983, 1984, and I'm living at Chawton House. And microwaves have just come into, they've just been invented and people are sort of getting their first microwaves. And my mother had just got one. And I went to the fridge one day, and sitting on one of these plates was a piece of pheasant pie, and I was hungry and it was lunchtime. So I took the plate with the pheasant pie, popped it in the microwave, turned it on. And this is gold all over here. There was a light show.
Yeah,
And I absolutely panicked, opened the door straight away, took it out thinking, oh my goodness, it was actually as cold as anything. It would have been in there for 4 seconds. So nothing actually happened at all. And, I put the cellophane back on the piece of cold pheasant pie, put it back in the fridge and never said a word. And my parents, it was only when they read Jane and Me, My Austen Heritage, which is my memoir, in 2017 was when they read about that and knew that had happened. And so there was no harm done. But in the moment, God, I still remember now my heart thumping, thinking, oh, my goodness, how am I going to explain this? But thankfully, no harm done.
Can you imagine that? Yeah, you would. No. I don't think you'd be forgiven for that.
No, and I'm extremely lucky that my parents have. I've got a couple of pieces on loan, so that I do actually take the. Because I travel all over the world, sort of doing events and things. So I have a little sort of kit of little heirlooms and things that I take with me, so people can see some things that Jane would have actually known and touched, and I'm very lucky that they have loaned me 2 plates to take with me.
What else have you got in this magical?
Well, I've got some keys to Chawton House, some of the original Jacobean, they'd be early 17th century keys. They're extraordinary. I've got the keys to Godmersham Park, which actually have Godmersham Park, which was Edward's residence down in Kent. I've got Knight. So he was 1639 to 1679. I have his signet ring. The things I have are mostly small because I travel. So they're things that will, yes, amongst other things, but they're some of the main items, and of course a couple of pieces of the china. And we have some gorgeous. Hester Bateman was a pioneering female silversmith of Jane's time, and Edward commissioned Hester Bateman to make all of the silver to go with this dinner service. So we have that as well, and all of that's got the family crest on it as well. And again, Jane would have, that would have been the silver that was in use when Jane was dining with Edward.
Fantastic. Now, you mentioned about growing up in the gorgeous Chawton House, surrounded by Austen history. How that shaped, do you think, your experience of big cities compared to the rural rootedness of both of your childhoods?
I think that, of course, because we're talking about Hampshire, which is not that far from London. So you're because you're on the peripheral of London, you do have, yes, of course, a country lifestyle, but close to, of course, the biggest city in England. And therefore, you sort of have both, don't you? I think people that live in that sort of band around London are lucky enough to actually experience both. But growing up in Chawton, of course, and as a child, you only know what you know, don't you? You don't necessarily analyse it as it's happening. It's only afterwards that you look back and sort of get a different perspective on sort of what's happening. And of course, there were, we're talking, I was born 170 years after Jane died, something of that sort of nature after Jane died. So, of course, that's a long time and a lot of things had changed, of course. But there were equally a lot of things that were the same. We have family traditions that there's absolutely no reason to believe Jane wouldn't have been doing when she was there. And they were family traditions, and we did them my entire childhood. Things like on Christmas, in the church, there's a wonderful reclining statue of Sir Richard Knight, the same chap whose signet ring I've got. And it's a big marble, full-size statue. And when Sir Richard was young, the Puritans banned Christmas in England. So from the ages of 5 to 20, he didn't celebrate Christmas. They might have been celebrated behind closed doors, who knows? But it would certainly have been in secret. They weren't celebrating, Christmas in a big way. So we have a family tradition of every year we put holly in Sir Richard's hand, because you can put holly in the hand of the statue at Christmas time, so that Sir Richard doesn't miss any more Christmases. Now, there's absolutely no reason why. We know that when Jane and the Austen ladies and indeed Edward and his daughter Fanny, we know from various letters and things that they had great fun looking through all the archives of the house, getting to know the ancestors, which are my ancestors too. So there's a lot of things there that as I said, yes, of course things have changed. There's cars in the village now. I mean, there's of course lots of things that are different. But there's equally a thread of consistency of family tradition and stories and ancestors and the place, itself.
And when did Jane Austen first start coming to London?
So we know that Jane's first visit was in 1796 when she was 20. And she came to London to see her brother Henry. And in fact, most of her visits to London, if not all, were to go and stay with Henry. He was the brother that was in London and actually living in some very fashionable areas of London. I mean, there's Knightsbridge, there's Soane Street, there's, Covent Garden. So he's in nice places in London. And she went to London almost, and not for the last couple of years, but almost to the end of her life from the age of 20. So yes, that was the first visit.
She had a number of different publishers.
She did. She had. You just think about how remarkable that is, and when you actually sort of trace through her publishing career and the decisions she made. And, so first of all, she published Sense and Sensibility on commission with Egerton, who was in London. It's today's equivalent of self-publishing. She paid for it. She was in control. She kept the copyright and she got the profit. She was obviously taking all the risk as well. But thankfully, that was successful. She then negotiated with Henry's support, but it was negotiated with Egerton that he would actually buy the copyright of Pride and Prejudice. So it wasn't printed on commission. He actually bought it from her. And Pride and Prejudice was a huge success. And, Jane made the least money in her lifetime from Pride and Prejudice than any other novel because she'd sold the copyright. So the publisher actually made 3 times what she did. When she'd then written her next novel, which was Mansfield Park, which was completely, written in Chawton, she decided to go back to the on-commission model. I think she was annoyed or she just was learning. She was managing a little author business, which obviously has become a very big author business, but she was managing at that time, a small author business. So she was thinking through these different things. So she then wanted to go back to publish on commission for Mansfield Park, but Egerton wasn't interested. So she sought publication elsewhere and actually ended up with Murray. And Murray was Lord Byron's publisher, a lot more prestigious than Egerton had ever been anyway. So as it happened, as often happens in life, doesn't it? The things that sometimes, those moments that happen that kind of force you to change or force you to sort of find alternatives sometimes do end up and often do end up in better sort of circumstances. And that's exactly what happened. So she then negotiated, as I said, the publication of Mansfield Park on commission and then Emma on commission. There was a delay to Emma's publication, which she had quite a lot of correspondence with Murray, because she'd planned for it to be published on the 16th of December, which would have been her 40th birthday. But it was late. It was late, and there was some delay in the printer getting paper. But by this point, because another great connection Jane has with London is the Prince Regent from Chawton House. She was in London visiting Henry, and Henry was actually sick. This is in 1815. Henry was sick, and a doctor was called. And as it happened, the doctor was also the prince's doctor. Now, I don't know if it was Henry that said it, but by all accounts, Henry was a bit of a blabbermouth when it came to Jane's anonymity. And anyway, while the doctor was there, it came up in conversation that, yes, she was the Jane Austen, who had written these novels. And it turns out that the Prince Regent was a huge fan of Jane's and that he had a copy of all of her novels published up to that point, which would have been Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice and Mansfield Park. He had a copy in all of his palaces, had copies of Jane's books. Anyway, on a later visit, when the doctor returns to see Henry, he brings with him an invitation for Jane to go to Chawton House, which was the prince's palace, and to view his library with his librarian. She wasn't going to meet the prince, but this was an invitation to come and obviously view his collection of books and speak to his librarian, and she did that. She had what, by all accounts, I think was a little bit of an awkward. I think in a letter there's a hint that it might have been a bit of an awkward visit, but she got to see this fantastic library. And what actually transpired from that was a correspondence between her and Reverend Clark, who was the librarian. And the next bit of correspondence that came said to her that she was, and I am very much paraphrasing here, but she was welcome to dedicate her next novel, being Emma, to the prince. Now she really, really didn't like the prince. I mean, he was a womanizing, drinking, and she was a woman who didn't approve of those things. So she writes this letter sort of saying, and again, I'm paraphrasing, can I just check whether or not this is an obligation or an offer? Now, I am paraphrasing, but that's what she said. And he said, no, of course it's an obligation, but the prince would be very happy if you did. So she ends up conceding, and Emma is indeed dedicated to the Prince Regent. Now, the next letter she got from Clark, which is the bit I absolutely love, was actually a letter suggesting that the subject of her next novel be a romance based in the House of Saxe-Coburg, which was the prince's royal, that was the name of the royal line at that point. And Jane was in a very difficult position because she doesn't see herself as a romance writer. And she doesn't want to write, she wants to write what she wants to write. Jane knows who she is. She doesn't need other people, does she, giving her direction in that kind of way. But she faced a very difficult and delicate, because she'd already conceded to the dedication to the prince, and now here's the next request. And she wrote what I think is just the finest letter of hers, where she says to him, after, I'm in the kind of second and third paragraph at this point, but she says that she could no more write a romance if her life depended upon it. She says that no, and she finishes with no, I must keep to my own style and go on in my own way, because although I may never succeed in that again, I shall certainly fail at any other. And I think, not only do I think she wrote a letter which absolutely pushed back the request, but without offence. If you read it, it is not, she's done it expertly. But also, I just think that statement is so powerful. And I remember hearing that quite young, and that statement has stuck with me my whole life. I must keep to my own style and go on in my own way. Because although I may fail at that, I'm not going to be successful doing what somebody else thinks I should do, am I? Or I'm not, you have to follow what you are good at. And all of that was sparked by, yes, a trip to Chawton House to see the Prince Regent's Library.
Thinking of what she said there, that was maybe her lifelong mantra as well. She had potentially, getting engaged and breaking it off and thinking, I've got to stay true to myself and who I am, and that authenticity was really important for her, and really hard to keep unless you have the support of your family and friends.
I mean, it's difficult to imagine now actually what life was like for women back then, when your point of view was of no interest to anybody, where your wishes and desires were of little interest to anybody, unless you were lucky. But in general, what a woman wanted, felt, what she was destined to be, what her heart, to a lot of women just was, as I said, of no interest to anybody. And that's difficult, obviously, in the era that we live in, where we're so much more empowered, to actually imagine that. And for Jane to be true to herself and stick to that, and be prepared to turn down a perfectly good offer of marriage from Harris Bigwithers, which would have seen her as the mistress of Manydown House. She would have been, she would have, yes, been the mistress of a big country manor. It would have set her up for life. But he was intellectually not her equal. He was, by all accounts, in his speech, he was a bit oafish. He was not Jane's man. And so she refused and walked away. And I can't imagine, it's difficult to know, what all the people around her would have said, because that would have secured her future, her mother's future, her sister's future. It would have brought incredibly advantageous contacts into her brother's lives, and yet she said no. Right. And that is brave, isn't it? That's brave. Or stupid.
I think it just shows you that strong will of character of knowing Absolutely. Your own self and knowing what you could be if you just apply yourself.
And here we are 250 years later, talking about her, celebrating her. So it works, didn't it? It works.
She loved theatre. Do we know which theatres exactly that she visited?
She visited and saw quite a number of plays that she mentions in her letters. I think one of the most notable actors she saw, and I do have his name written down here because I just to make sure I get it right, is Edmund Kean. And he was a great Shakespearean actor of the time. And I also know, because they did it at Chawton House this Christmas, I also know that she saw a play in London that was about harlequins. And so this Christmas at Chawton House, as part of the Christmas decorations, they set up a stage and had mannequin statues, I suppose, dressed as all of the characters from the play that she had seen. in London. One story that I love about Jane in London, which again I just think sends my imagination, reeling or running, is Jane going to the spring exhibition at the Royal Academy in 1813. And she went because there was lots of portraits there. And she actually went to lots of portrait galleries looking for portraits that she thought represented her characters. And so, because you've got to think, I mean, now when I'm writing sometimes, I might actually go online and find somebody that looks like the character I'm writing about, because it's helpful to visualize them, isn't it? It is helpful. But of course, Jane didn't have the internet, did she? So she went to portrait galleries. And there is a letter where she actually says that she was disappointed not to find a portrait that looks like her idea of Elizabeth Bennet. And because she couldn't find a portrait that really sort of encapsulated what she thought Lizzie looked like, she went to other galleries searching. And I just think that's such a lovely thought, I think, of Jane sort of going on in search of her own characters in the galleries of London.
She's not very descriptive, is she, of her characters? She allows us to build our own image of what, for example, Mr. Darcy looks like. So then, of course, when you get a new adaptation out and so actor appears.
And again, that's clever. I mean, it's so clever because it allowed each reader to have their own. And perhaps if she'd spelt him out, perhaps if she described him, half of her readers would have gone, I don't like dark-haired men, blondes, whatever. I don't like, So by actually allowing that, and there is something that I think is equally magical about the fact that we don't know what Jane looked like. Because we have a similar situation with her as we do with Mr. Darcy, is that we have bits of information. We know her height, we know her hair colour, we know things like that. But we don't know what she looked like. We don't have the only drawing of her which has been authenticated is in the portrait gallery in London and was done by her sister Cassandra. And it is a full face-on pencil and sort of sketch that's been coloured in areas. Even, Cassandra and the family all said it's not a good likeness of Jane. It's not, that isn't a faithful representation. She didn't really capture what Jane looked like. And again, the fact that we don't know, that we don't have that information does allow everybody, doesn't it, to create their own Jane. Everybody can have their own image of what they think Jane looked like, which, as I said, mirrors that sort of Mr. Darcy thing and is part of why I think so many people, when I do events, the people I meet who Jane is one of their best friends, and they are often people who may have had, often their story is quite similar. Often there'll be a similar thread through it, that perhaps when they were teenagers or in their early 20s, something happened in their life that was upsetting. Perhaps somebody died or their parents separated or they had to move country or whatever it was. But something happened that really threw their life upside down. And in that moment, whether it be through serendipity or an aunt or somebody they knew actually put a copy of usually Pride and Prejudice in their hands and said, read it, it'll help you through this period. And it did. And for those people, in that moment, Jane became, as important to them as their best friend and their sister, and she's in their inner circle. And that sort of relationship lasts a lifetime with those people. But all of them have the space, as I said, within this story to create their own Jane, don't they? And to create their own version of what their best friend Jane looks like, exactly what her personality was.
I think that's a really, really good point. I hadn't thought of it like that. I mean, I'd gone from Ellen Montgomery, Anne of Green Gables, and then I was 15 when Colin Firth hit the screen.
And that was you hooked, was it?
That was it. I was like, how have I not known about this story? So I read it. I just couldn't get away from, and of course I wanted to know what happened in the next week's episode. So I just read the book in maybe 2 nights, and I was just absolutely hooked. And then, of course, Emma, and I was just then hooked. I realised that someone was writing for me.
There is something about the way Jane writes. So obviously, as a woman, I can only speak about what that experience is. That really does speak to you, doesn't it? Like you are an intelligent, switched-on woman in a way that is is deep, isn't it? That, in that sort of way. That's a wonderful way of putting it.
I hadn't thought about the importance of images for her characters before. And I'm just thinking about the artworks that she talks about. You got Mansfield House, you've got the portrait of Georgiana and Fitzwilliam. Of course, you've got Harriet Smith, Mr. Martin Gift in the end. So pictures are really important.
Jane Austen's house have actually had an exhibition of Cassandra's art, because Jane's sister Cassandra was really quite a good artist. I mean, really good. And she actually, when Jane was very young, before she was a teenager, I think it was that she did a history of England. So this is her juvenilia. So when she was young, still living in Steventon, Jane was writing stories. She was, that was the early formative, her learning her craft as a writer. And all of those works from about the age of 11 or 12 actually still exist today. And they're bound into 3 volumes, one of which is at the Bodleian Library and a couple of at the British Library. But in there, we also have something called A History of England, where she's written these pieces about various kings and queens and things, and which are quite satirical, I suppose. But they've got illustrations all the way through, and all the illustrations are done by Cassandra. And so she was getting Cassandra to do illustrations for her work when she was really young. So Cassandra. So yes, and of course, again, it's difficult to imagine, isn't it, a world without photographs, a world where the only way that you saw faces was because a portrait artist had painted them, or somebody that was good enough to paint had painted them. That was it. There was no other way of seeing faces. And as we say, when you are writing about someone or about people, visualization is really helpful. And it's certainly something that modern authors very much use as part of the toolkit, is visualizing characters, and equally visualizing your target market, visualizing who your readers are, visualizing, this is obviously, we're talking about human connection, aren't we, through writing and characters and your readers. I think it's fascinating, absolutely, to think that was important to Jane, but she obviously had to have a different route to getting that.
Got one more question, and I'm hoping no one's ever asked you this before, but who knows? If Jane could spend one day in 21st century London with you, where would you take her, and what do you think would delight or horrify her the most?
That's a question, isn't it? Goodness. Where would I take her? I would preface this with the fact that whilst I do come to London quite often, I'm usually coming for an event and I'm sort of in and out, if you know what I mean. I did live in London for 10 years in my 20s, but that was a long time ago now. So I'm saying, if I think about London as a whole, my knowledge of London isn't necessarily today. My knowledge of London will be, a little while ago. I think that what I would want to do, I think I would probably, circling back to where, something I mentioned earlier on, I think I would go to Covent Garden. I think I'd want to take her back to those, the exciting places, much more than a publisher's office or a, I think it would be to go with her, because certainly, in assuming it's still like it today, then in Covent Garden you still find street performers, don't you? And you still find, and very close in around that area, you've still got theatre, you've still got, so that sort of buzz, I suppose, of that excitement of performing arts is still very much alive in that area. And that is where I think I would take Jane. I think I would love to experience that with her. Do you know what I mean? I think of anything, if I would, what would I want to do with Jane? I'd love to, as I said, walk with Jane through Covent Garden, or go to a play with her, or, that seems like, because I imagine that's her at her happiest. I imagine that's her laughing, that's her probably saying some very wicked things about all the people we can see, but making me laugh, I can just sort of imagine Jane really soaking it up and enjoying the hustle and bustle and the people and all the observation that she can do. Thinking about what she might be horrified about today, I mean, where does one start? I mean, I think that's, again, because, and again, we have to think about Jane in a world before electricity. There was no hot showers. There were no, it was just such a different world that I think it would be quite difficult probably for her to pick out anything individual. And I'm actually going to just tell you little story that's just popped into my mind is my mother's actually from Australia. And so my father came from Chawton House, went to Australia when after school, when he'd finished school. Spent a few years in Australia, met my mother over here. They got married. When my mother, who grew up in mid-north South Australia, so we are in the middle of nowhere, in a tiny little town in the middle of nowhere. And she got on a boat with my father and my grandmother, who had flown to Australia from Chawton House. And they went back to Chawton. And my mother, as I said, had grown up in country South Australia, was then taken up the driveway to Chawton House, which was going to be her new home, because that's where my parents, that's where we live. And the difference between those two experiences, that's an extreme cultural difference. That's just an extreme difference. And when I talk to my mum about it now and kind of say to her, what was that like coming up the drive and seeing this big, grand, English manor house? But she'll say to me, by that point, it was she was so overwhelmed with everything being so different that she couldn't take any of it in at all, if you know what I mean. And she didn't have what you might imagine, which is that first moment of, oh my goodness, And I think if Jane was in today's world, I think it would be the same for her. I don't, you know what I mean? I think we are just, fundamentally, we're not different people, which is why her work is so relevant today, because human nature has not changed one iota, has it? And that's something I find really fascinating about her work, is it really shows that it actually doesn't matter what time period you're in. It doesn't matter how advanced man's got at any particular time. We're all exactly the same as we've always been, haven't we? We've got the same characters in our midst. We've got the same blend of personalities and variances. It's all exactly the same when you come down to those sort of different character traits in people. And I think that's fascinating, because that won't just be true for Jane's time. That'll be true for millennia, won't it? And as I said, and when we think back at people, I think it's really easy to think about people that have come before us as not being the same as us. And that's just not true. We're all, which I, as I said, find very interesting.
So, Caroline, I know you're a very busy lady, but what have you got in the works at the moment?
I've got two really exciting projects that we're working on. One, of course, is the continued growth of the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation, which is now 12 years old, the foundation, and has funded and sort of supported literacy projects all around the world in every continent. But we have just opened the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation North American Friends, which is basically the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation as a charity, standalone charity in America, which is a really exciting development, because in the world of Jane Austen, America is, the biggest population of Jane Austen fans, and they're ardent with it. So that really gives us an incredible opportunity to expand our literacy impact, to help more children and adults around the world, learn to read and write. So that's a really exciting. So it's literally that we launched in October. So that's very fresh. So as I said, we'll be growing that. The other thing I'm working on, which is a sort of the next phase of the work that I'm doing in terms of storytelling and heritage preservation, is me and my family. We sort of have a collective memory of the last 50 years of Chawton House as as a family home. And obviously that's the 50 years of when the English country estates were in decline. That's when the financial trouble, that's when the financial pressures were insurmountable for most. And between 1945 and 1955, a grand house in England was demolished every 5 days for 10 years. The average, because estate taxes had risen to 80% in the 1940s. So it was just impossible to keep them. But anyway, somehow we've managed to hang on. So we have this sort of collective memory. And I've been storytelling as Jane Austen's niece online for a long time. And over that time, I have collated hundreds and hundreds of photographs from our family albums. I have written and collated an awful lot of stories and people's memories and details of artefacts that we still own and still have in our collections and things like that. So the next phase of that work is to actually, and this year I'm creating the Austen Knights of Chawton, a family archive. And I'm actually going to turn all of this content into a proper archive that will be there forever for Janeites and historians and future generations, because I think we have this, as I said, this first-hand experience, not only of, and this isn't only important in terms of Jane Austen's family story and what happened to Chawton but it's also, it's a very, very typical story of the last 50 years in any of these ancestral homes, and of the decline and the ultimate having to give them up. And so I think that, for English history, as much as for the Jane Austen story, I think that there'll be things in there that will be of interest to people. So that's the next phase of my storytelling work, is to actually, as I said, I've already amassed all of this stuff, and it would just be such a shame if that was lost. It needs to be kept, and people need to have access to it, and so that, as I said, there's a first-hand account of life in a house like that and its decline. It's important, and I am so grateful for being born and and raised in Chawton, being related to Jane Austen. I wouldn't swap this for anything. I am so lucky, and I know that, and I have a real sense of gratitude, and therefore I have to do. I'm compelled to use it to the best I can. I've been given something that is such a gift and such a treat and such a wonderful start to life. I mean, growing up with Jane Austen as a role model when you're a young girl is a really good, empowering start to life. And so at this phase of my life, I'm extremely happy. Nothing makes me happier than doing things, as I said, that actually make good with that. And don't let it go to waste. Otherwise, otherwise, as I said, it would all be wasted, wouldn't it? So that's the next project. I think we'll start doing our first exhibitions within a year. They'll be digital. It'll be like a digital museum. And I think we'll first start doing the first exhibitions within a year. But I fully anticipate that there's a good 5 years of archiving to do to get the content I've got now. And I've got other family members. So this year, when I'm over there, I'm in Australia at the moment. I tend to winter over here, or English winter over here, and then I'm over in the UK for the summer. But I'm also going to start collecting oral recordings from other members of the family with their memories and things. So we've also got people's voices in the archive. Because I think, I look back, and when I'm researching Jane and the family and things, I just think, wouldn't it be amazing to hear George Austen talking about something, So because I think, it does bring it to life, doesn't it? So yes, that's the next exciting project.
How exciting! Well, you've got so many, and I think Auntie Jane would be
I hope
proud
so.
of you.
I think she would, because I and not actually because of anything I'm doing, but actually because I am keeping to my own style, and I'm going on my own way. And that's what I hope she'd be proud of.
Good for you.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.